Well, good morning, everyone. As you can tell, I'm recording this on a day when we're dressed casual, and several of us have been over to the health center outdoors where we sang and did some fun things to cheer up our workers, our team members who are there at the health center. So that's why I'm a little more casual today, but it feels good. I did think this morning that I would say just a word about how I approach Bible study. There are lots of ways to do it. One can be very academic, one can be very study the history, one can do a lot of different ways. And I realized that my method is probably more of not necessarily having the greatest knowledge or study, although I read quite a bit to prepare, is I like to just live with the text, live with the scripture for a while, where it kind of sinks in, and then I share with you what seems important to me. And so I think that's the approach that I take. Today is the first of a series that I'm calling Profiles in Faith. And we are going to be reading of major people of faith throughout the Hebrew scripture and the Christian scripture, the Old Testament, the New Testament. And we're starting today with Abraham and Sarah. And I'm calling them our founding parents. And the story, we're going to be reading selections from Genesis chapter 12 all the way through Genesis 22. It covers a good part of time, but we're going to just pick out some of the key areas in that about Abraham and Sarah. So who is Abraham? Who are Abraham and Sarah? Their original names is Abram and Sarai, A-I. I don't know how to pronounce that. And then later on, God changes their names to Abraham and Sarah. So forgive me if I bounce back and forth with the names. Abram was the son of Terah, who was the ninth in descendants of generations from Noah. He had two brothers, and we'll also learn or hear about Lot, who was his nephew, the son of one of his brothers. Abram was 86-year-old when he had a son named Ishmael from the servant of Hagar, the servant of Sarah. And then he was 99 when he had his son Isaac. That was his and Sarah's together. Abraham is important both to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. For Judaism, he's the founding father of the covenant between the people of God and God alone. For Christianity, he's like the prototype of believers. We follow the example of his faith. And for Islam, Abram is the link in the chain of prophets from Adam to Muhammad. So where did they live? Well, the Middle East is a big place. They came from Ur of the Chaldees, which is in sort of like the port area of Basra in Iraq today. But when this story starts, they are already living in Haran, which is sort of the north part of Iraq where it runs into today Syria and Turkey. And then, of course, God calls them to come to the land of Canaan, and they come down to Shechem, and then, of course, they eventually settle more closer to what is now called Hebron, and they are buried in the Cave of the Patriarchs, which is a place that you can go to, conditions on the ground permitting, today and see. So the highlights of the story are God's call of Abraham and Sarah in Egypt, the Lord's covenant, Hagar and Ishmael, the birth of Isaac, Hagar and Ishmael are sent away, and then Abraham was tested. So Genesis chapter 12, the call of Abram. The Lord had said to Abram, Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Verse 4. So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Do you remember how difficult it was to decide to move to Village on the Green? Do you remember selling your house or getting rid of some things and downsizing, or even any time you've moved somewhere? It's not an easy thing to do. I suppose some people find it easy to pick up and move, but most of us do not. And so I think as we read this, it's interesting to see God called Abram and he picked up and moved. And he had wife and nephew and possessions and people they had acquired, servants. Abram was already a fairly wealthy man when he picked up and left Haran in Iraq to go to Canaan in what is now Israel. And he had high expectations because God promised him, I'm going to make you into a great nation. I'm going to bless you. I'm promising that whoever curses you, I will curse. People on earth will be blessed through you. Those are high expectations. And I can imagine Abram was very excited about this new beginning and the promises God had made. Well, we're going to drop down to verse 10. Now there was a famine in the land. Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. And I'm going to take a break because you realize there are a number of times in history where people have, with famine and problems, have gone to Egypt because Egypt with the Nile River had source of water and had a civilization that managed to survive some of those tough times. And so it was often a refuge. Verse 11, as Abram was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarah, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but let you live. So say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. You know, that's a lapse of trust in God. He was fearful that he would lose his life, and so he passes off his wife as his sister. Boy, Abram, what a mistake. That reminds me of those who have said that the opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is fear. Fear is when we don't trust. Fear is when we then are not faithful in the way that we trust. So here it is, Abram's fears have overwhelmed his trust that this would be okay. Well, verse 14, we learn more about what happens in Egypt. When Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarah was indeed a very beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. He treated Abram well for her sake, and Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. Verse 17. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarah. Pharaoh summoned Abram. What have you done to me? He said. Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister so that I took her to be my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her back and go. Get out of here. Then Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything he had. It's interesting to me that Pharaoh showed more integrity than Abram did during this little segment. But you know, even though it was a lapse of faith for sure and a giving into fear, the result was Abram left with a household that was even stronger, with more servants and more possessions. And so Abram went back to the land of Canaan, better than before, in spite of this lapse of his judgment. Well, we're going to move to Genesis chapter 15, which is about the Lord's covenant with Abram. Verse 1. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus, someone in another area. And Abram said, You've given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. And he clearly very discouraged that he had no children. Verse 4, Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. The Lord took Abram outside and said, Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Of course you can't. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. And verse 6, Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Verse 7, he also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. You know, verse 6 really is probably the key description for us as we think about Abram's faith and him as the pioneer of faith for us today. Abram believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Believed in the Lord. That is the key. Well, now we go to Genesis 16. Now Sarah, Abram's wife, who had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar, one of those slaves he picked up when they were down there. So she said to Abram, The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Not a good idea. A moment of weakness for both of them, perhaps. And yet, understandably, because one of the things that was so important in families was to be able to have children and grandchildren and pass down what you have through them. And your life and your legacy was carried on in your children. But you and I know that this is a disaster waiting, because Sarah and the servant girl Hagar are not going to get along. And we could see that a mile away. But Abram, verse 2, agreed to what Sarah said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, already 10 years there, Sarah, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarah said to Abram, You are responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she's pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Ooh, Sarah and Abram are not in good relations at this point. That just, everything is stirred up. Verse 6, Your slave is in your hands, Abram said. Do with her whatever you think best. Ooh, that's a bad sign. So then Sarah mistreated Hagar. So she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from? And where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress, Sarah, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. So Hagar has a promise from the Lord. The angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers, predicting that this is going to be a tough road. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. Well, we come now to God's promise of Abraham and Sarah having their own son. And we've skipped some areas where there are messengers that come and tell them that they're going to have a son. And both Sarah and Abraham laugh and don't believe it and find it unbelievable. And yet, guess what? We get to chapter 21, the birth of Isaac. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God promised to him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Wow. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. And she added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. Well, what's going to happen with Hagar and Ishmael now that Sarah and Abraham have their own son? Verse 8. The child grew and was weaned, and on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking. And she said to Abraham, get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. Well, the matter greatly distressed Abraham, because it did concern his son. But God tells him, do not be distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring. So there will be two nations. And you learn a little bit about history about those nations. Verse 14. So early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He sent them on her shoulders and then sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. Some food and a little bit of water? That's not very generous. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. And then she went off and sat down about a bow shot away. For she thought, I cannot watch the boy die. And as she sat there, she began to sob. She thought this was over. They had been abandoned. 17. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what is the matter, Hagar? Don't be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. While he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife for him from Egypt. So he went on to have his own tribe and clan and people. The final chapter we're going to read is chapter 22, where Abraham was tested. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said, "Abraham, here I am," he replied. Then God said, listen carefully to this. God said, "Take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Now that sounds horrible to you and to me, and it was horrible. It is not as foreign in the time of Abraham as it is to us for there to be sacrifices of children and people to gods, but never was there this sacrifice that God had asked of anyone else, but he asked Abraham to do this. Verse 3, early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Did you catch that? Abraham had 3 days to think about and to turn back or to do something else, but he did not. Verse 6, Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, "Father, yes, my son, the fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. I can't imagine a more difficult moment in one's life. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham's faith was reckoned to him as righteousness. Remember that verse. So 13, Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by his horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." Wow, the Lord will provide. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time. And he said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld even your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. Well, that's the highlights of Abraham's story. His faith and trust in God was unwavering. He had fears that would show up from time to time and get in the way. And you think, what kind of an example was that? And yet, that's a very human example that you and I can relate to. For fears can overcome us. But our faith is about trust. Not just what we know or what we think or feel, but trusting in the Lord no matter what. Well, next time we're going to read about Isaac, the son who was almost sacrificed, and his wife Rebekah, because they are our next two profiles in faith. Have a good day.